I want to start with a number. 70. That's how many ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz on Wednesday, June 24th. A 105% jump from the day before. The highest single-day count since this entire crisis began back in February. For about 48 hours, the ceasefire actually looked like it was working. Then on Thursday, a drone hit a container ship called the Ever Lovely. By Saturday morning, Bahrain was reporting Iranian drones over its own territory. By Sunday, Iran had announced for the second time in 9 days that it was closing the strait again, this time citing Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Ship transits that had hit 70 on Wednesday collapsed to 12 by Sunday. 5 of the 8 vessels that did cross had switched off their tracking transponders, just to avoid being seen. So here's a question I want you to sit with for a second. Was the ceasefire signed on June 17th real? Or was it never anything more than a pause button that both sides knew? Going in, they'd eventually unpress. I think the honest answer is neither. I think what we're watching is something more specific and frankly more interesting than the ceasefire failed. I think we're watching what happens when 2 governments sign the exact same legal document and walk away having agreed to 2 completely different things, and then spend the following weeks trying to settle that disagreement, not with lawyers, but with drones. Today I want to walk you through 3 things. First, the forward sentence buried in Article 5 of the ceasefire that is, in my view, the actual root cause of every single incident since the signing, not a footnote to the crisis itself. Second, why the economic logic Iran is following doesn't actually require the strait to be closed, which is the part almost no Western coverage gets right. And third, why this time the Gulf Arab states are doing something they have not done in this war before, and what that tells us about who Iran's real audience actually is. And as always, I want to be upfront. This is my analysis. I'm going to show you my reasoning and the sourcing behind it. And you can tell me where you think I've got it wrong. Let's go. Okay, let's start with the timeline, because the order of events here matters more than the outrage. February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran, what the Pentagon called Operation Epic Fury, hitting nuclear infrastructure, missile sites, and command centers. Iran's response, consistent with everything we know about how Tehran fights wars it cannot win conventionally, is to go horizontal. It doesn't try to match American air power. It closes the Strait of Hormuz instead. Within days, roughly 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships are stranded in the Persian Gulf. Major shipping lines, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspend transits entirely. Insurance premiums on Hormuz crossings jump from 0.125% of vessel value to as high as 0.4%, which for a large crude tanker is a $250,000 swing on a single voyage. For the next several months, this becomes the actual war. Not the airstrikes the strait. Mines get laid. Ships get hit. The Sonangol Namibe, a tanker anchored near Kuwait, struck by a sea drone 500 miles from the strait itself, showing how far this conflict had already metastasized. The tugboat Seyfin Prestige sunk. Iran announces in March that the strait is closed to any vessel going to and from the ports of the US, Israel, or their allies, which in practice means almost everyone, since almost every flag of convenience touches one of those 3 economies somewhere in its ownership chain. By June, both sides are exhausted enough to talk. On June 14th, mediators announced a memorandum of understanding. On June 17th, Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian signed it at the Palace of Versailles. 14 points. The headline terms: Iran allows toll-free passage through Hormuz for 60 days. Mines get cleared. The U.S. lifts its own naval blockade of Iranian ports. And a 60-day clock starts running toward a permanent settlement. Here's Article 5. And I want you to listen to this very carefully because I'm going to come back to it again and again in this video. Iran and Oman would discuss the future management of navigation through the strait. That's the entire sentence. That is the complete legal architecture governing who controls one of the most important waterways on the planet. the corridor that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a third of its seaborne ling. Discuss the future management of navigation. Now think about what that sentence actually commits anyone to. It doesn't say Iran retains control. It doesn't say Iran relinquishes control. It doesn't define what management means, whether that's traffic separation schemes, which is a normal and legal thing for a coastal state to do, or fee collection, which under the customary international law of transit passage, it almost certainly is not. It doesn't even specify what happens if Iran and Oman can't agree on what future management looks like. Washington's reading of that sentence, based on everything U.S. officials have said publicly since, is this is a transitional formality. The strait returns to its pre-war status internationally governed, freely transited, no tolls, no permission requirements, and Iran and Oman have a chat about logistics that changes nothing fundamental. Tehran's reading, based on what its own negotiators have said, is the opposite. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who leads Iran's negotiating team, said this directly during a visit to Oman. Everyone should know that management of the strait will never return to what it was before. Not we're discussing it. Not we're open to it. Never. Both governments signed the same 4 words. One side thinks they agreed to a formality. The other side thinks they secured a permanent transformation in who controls the Persian Gulf's most important artery. I want to give this pattern a name because I think once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere in how this conflict unfolds. This is a phantom agreement. A document that exists on paper was genuinely signed by both parties, and yet doesn't exist as a shared understanding between them. It's not a broken promise. It's a promise that was never actually the same promise on both sides of the table. And phantom agreements don't fail randomly. They fail at the exact point where the ambiguity gets tested by something concrete. In this case, that test was a shipping corridor. On June 23rd, the International Maritime Organization launches a voluntary evacuation framework for the roughly 11,000 sailors still stranded in the Gulf, offering 2 routes, a northern corridor under Iranian oversight and a southern one that hugs the Omani coastline, monitored by the U.S. and Oman jointly. Hours before the ever-lovely incident, the hurricane issues a public warning that this southern corridor was established without Iran's knowledge or consent, and that ships using it would face consequences. On June 25th, at 1410 UTC, the ever-lovely of Singapore flag container ship, completely civilian, owned by Taiwan's Evergreen Marine, gets hit by a drone roughly 7.5 nautical miles off the Omani coast. On that exact corridor, the bridge windows shatter, nobody dies, the ship keeps moving. This is not, in my reading, a rogue strike by an undisciplined unit. This is the IRC enforcing, with force, its own interpretation of 4 words that the United States believed meant something else entirely. And the responses since then have only deepened the split. Within 24 hours, CENTCOM hits Iranian missile and drone storage sites, plus coastal radar installations. Trump tells reporters, I don't like the fact that they took a shot yesterday, actually 4. They shouldn't be doing that, so you'll find out. Then, on Saturday morning, and this is the part that I think most coverage outside the specialist press has actually missed, Bahrain reports Iranian drones over its own territory. Not a ship this time. A sovereign Gulf state. The IRC's statement isn't a denial. It says simply that it targeted several locations of the U.S. terrorist army in the Gulf. That's an admission, just reframed. Egypt and Kuwait condemned the strike within hours. By Sunday, Iran has declared the strait closed again, its second closure announcement in 9 days this time, citing Israeli strikes on Lebanon as a trigger. Which tells you something important we'll come back to. Iran is explicitly linking the fate of Hormuz to a conflict happening 500 miles away. One that the United States has almost no control over. Ship transit data from the maritime intelligence firm Windward shows crossings falling from 35 on Saturday to just 12 on Sunday, with most of those ships running dark transponders off, deliberately invisible, resembling the late blockade baseline more than a functioning open strait, in Windward's own words. And here's where the discrepancy gets genuinely strange. CENTCOM says 55 merchant ships transited that same Saturday and insists safe passage remains intact. Windward's independent tracking says otherwise. Both figures are being reported as fact by different outlets. Neither side has an incentive to be straight with you about it. Iran wants the closure to look total. CENTCOM wants the reopening to look successful, and the truth is probably that both are partly engineering the number they want the world to see. Within 48 hours of all that, on Sunday, Iran and the US reportedly established a direct communications hotline specifically to prevent further military incidents in the Strait, according to Iran's own press TV. So you have, in the span of one weekend, a drone strike, a retaliatory airstrike, a second drone strike on a sovereign state, a reclosure of the Strait, a transit collapse, and a new hotline meant to stop exactly this cycle from repeating. That is not the rhythm of a ceasefire holding. That's the rhythm of two sides testing each other's red lines in real time, with a hotline installed specifically because everyone involved expects more of this, not less. Now I want to deal with the part of this story that I think Western media coverage gets almost completely backwards. The instinct is to read every Iranian drone strike as Tehran trying to close the strait. I don't think that's what's actually happening anymore, and the economics explain why. Closing the strait entirely costs Iran something specific. It costs Iran toll revenue. You cannot tax traffic that doesn't exist. A fully closed Hormuz generates $0 for Tehran. It generates maximum global economic pain, which has real value as leverage, but it generates nothing for Iran's own treasury. And we now know, from Wall Street Journal reporting that's been independently corroborated by multiple outlets, exactly what Iran wants instead. Tehran is pitching a maritime service fee system for the Strait charging vessels for security, safety, and environmental services that it estimates could generate around $40 billion a year for the participating coastal states. The model being studied, according to Iranian officials, is Turkey's Dardanelles arrangement, where under the 1936 Montreux Convention, Turkey charges a transit tax currently about $6.70 per ton for lighthouse, sanitation, and life-saving services through that strait. Iran's also reportedly looking at the Malacca Strait model, where Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore jointly patrol and split the costs, with funding support from Japan's Nippon Foundation. Here's the strategic logic, and I want to walk through it carefully, because I think it's the single most underappreciated piece of this entire crisis. A strait that is technically open, but persistently unsafe, is more valuable to Iran than a strait that is fully closed. Think about what an uncertain strait does to the economics of shipping. War risk insurance premiums on Hormuz transits had already climbed before this latest incident from 0.125% of vessel value to between 0.2% and 0.4%. Every additional incident, every drone strike, every "we will face consequences" warning from the IRC pushes those premiums higher. At some point, paying Iran's proposed service fee becomes cheaper for a shipping company than paying the insurance premium for the uncoordinated route. That is not a coincidence. That is, I think, the actual design. You don't need to fully close a choke point to extract rent from it. You need ships to be uncertain enough, often enough, that a guaranteed safe passage fee becomes the economically rational choice over a free but risky alternative. Every strike on a vessel using the wrong corridor is also simultaneously an advertisement for the corridor Iran does control. The Ever-Lovely wasn't just punished for using the Omani route. It was a demonstration to every shipping insurer and every P&I club on earth that the ERC designated route is the one that actually delivers on its safety promise. And Iran's negotiators have started saying this almost explicitly. An Iranian official involved in the talks, Hossein Ghorbanzadeh, told Iran International that Tehran intends to resume collecting fees once the 60-day suspension in the MOU expires, framing it carefully. Charging ships solely for passing through the waterway has no meaning under international law, he said. But fees collected in exchange for services provided to vessels are a different matter. Entirely. That's a precise legal distinction, and it's the same distinction Turkey uses to justify the Dardanelles toll. Iran isn't claiming the right to block transit. It's claiming the right to be paid for the privilege of safe transit, which, if you control enough of the actual risk environment, amounts to the same thing in practice. I want to steelman the American and Gulf position here, because I think it deserves real weight. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's rejection of this whole framework was blunt. No country in the world has the right to charge for the use of international waterways, and that will never be an acceptable condition in any agreement. He warned that allowing it would set a precedent that could spread like a plague, and he's not wrong about the precedent risk. If Iran successfully monetizes Hormuz, what stops Egypt from trying something similar with Suez beyond its existing toll structure, or Indonesia and Malaysia from tightening the screws on Malacca, or any coastal state bordering any strait from deciding that security services justifies a unilateral fee? The entire architecture of customary international law around transit passage exists precisely to prevent that scenario, and any formal fee system would, under current frameworks, require consensus from all 176 member states of the IMO, which Iran is never going to get. But here's what that legal clarity doesn't resolve. Iran doesn't need IMO consensus to make the fee system work in practice. It needs enough insurers, enough shipping companies, and enough Gulf states to find a de facto arrangement more convenient than the alternative. Legal legitimacy and operational reality are two different battles, and Iran appears to be fighting the second one, while everyone else argues about the first. Now this brings me to the part of this story I think is actually the most significant, and the part that almost nobody outside specialist shipping and Gulf affairs coverage has connected properly. Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates' 5 Gulf Cooperation Council states sent a formal letter to the International Maritime Organization explicitly rejecting Iran's self-declared Persian Gulf Strait Authority. The letter instructed commercial and merchant vessels not to engage with that authority and not to use any route Iran unilaterally designates. This is not 5 separate countries grumbling individually. This is a coordinated, written institutional rejection submitted to the actual global body responsible for shipping regulation. For context on how unusual that level of unity is, throughout this war, the Gulf states have generally tried to hedge. Saudi Arabia kept the channel open to Tehran the entire time and joined a quadrilateral mediation effort with Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan. The way went further still. It formally exited OPEC back in April, severing one of its last institutional links to a Saudi-led regional framework, and it's now running what regional analysts describe as a genuine dual-track strategy, resuming maritime trade with Iran on one hand, while accelerating East Coast port and rail infrastructure specifically designed to route cargo around the strait, entirely on the other. Qatar, meanwhile, hosts CENTCOM's largest forward headquarters in the region, while maintaining functional relations with Tehran, which makes the escalation for Doha an operational necessity rather than a diplomatic preference. These are not 5 states that normally move in lockstep. And yet on the Hormuz fee question specifically, they did. That tells you something the strike and counterstrike headlines don't. This isn't really a 2-party negotiation between Washington and Tehran anymore. It's effectively become Iran versus a unified Gulf bloc plus the United States, with Oman caught awkwardly in between, and Oman's position here matters enormously, because Oman just told European officials, according to a Bloomberg report, that there is no way of going back to the pre-war status quo in the Strait, and that fees may end up being charged for things like depollution or navigation assistance. That's not Iran saying that. That's Oman, the other coastal state, the one Washington has been counting on to anchor the Free Strait position quietly, conceding that some version of Tehran's argument has already won. So who is Iran's $40 billion fee proposal actually for? I'd argue it was never primarily aimed at convincing Washington Rubio's never acceptable rejection was entirely predictable, and Tehran knew it going in. I think the real audience is the Gulf states themselves, and specifically the revenue sharing structure of the pitch matters here. Iran isn't proposing to keep the $40 billion. It's proposing that participating countries share it. That's a direct incentive aimed at peeling off exactly the unity that letter to the IMO represents. If even one Gulf state and Oman's signal suggests it might be exactly one calculates that a slice of $40 billion in annual revenue is worth breaking ranks for, Iran doesn't need to win the legal argument. It needs to fracture 5 votes into 4 or 3 and let economics do the rest. And there's a wider trade angle here too, because Iran has reportedly taken this pitch beyond the Gulf, entirely presenting the fee concept to China as well, according to multiple Wish source reports. China imports roughly 40% of its oil through Hormuz. If Beijing finds the predictability of a paid, managed strait more attractive than the unpredictability of a contested free one, and China has historically preferred stability, purchased with money over open-ended military risk, that's a second major power whose interests start aligning with Tehran's framework rather than Washington's. Okay, so let me give you 3 specific things to watch, because I think the headlines about whether the ceasefire holds are going to keep missing the actual signal. First, watch the insurance and shipping data, not the diplomatic statements. War risk premiums were already climbing before the ever-lovely incident. If they spike further after this latest round, and especially if more vessels start running dark, transponders off, the way Windward documented over the weekend, that tells you the market has already priced in Iran's argument, regardless of what any memorandum says. Shipping companies don't care who's legally right. They care what's actually survivable. Second, watch whether the IMO resumes its evacuation framework, and on which corridor. It's currently paused. If it resumes specifically on the northern Iranian overseen route, rather than the Omani one, that's the IMO, a neutral international body, implicitly treating Tehran as the operative authority over the strait. That would be a far bigger structural shift than another round of strikes, because it would mean the institution actually responsible for global shipping safety has, in practice if not in law, accepted Iran's framing of Article 5. Third, watch whether any single Gulf state breaks from that 5-country IMO letter. Oman's comments to European officials are the first real crack. If Oman, or anyone else, moves from discussing the fee framework to actually implementing a piece of it, even something modest, like a dip pollution charge, that's the moment Iran's $40 billion pitch stops being a negotiating position and starts becoming a fact on the water. And once a fee structure exists anywhere on that strait, rolling it back becomes vastly harder than it was to prevent in the first place. Tolls, once collected, create constituencies that defend them. I'll leave you with this. Every channel covering this story right now is asking whether the June 17th ceasefire is going to hold. I understand why it's the dramatic, immediate question, and it gives you something concrete to report on every single day. But I think that's the wrong question. For the same reason, it would have been the wrong question on June 18th, the day after the signing. The ceasefire was never really one agreement. It was 2 different agreements wearing the same 4 words, signed by 2 governments who each walked away from Versailles believing they'd gotten what they came for. Every drone strike since then hasn't been a violation of that document. It's been each side trying to write the rest of the sentence that nobody actually finished the future management of navigation using force, because nobody was willing to define it on paper when they had the chance. The 60-day clock on the move is still running. Whether it ends with an actual definition of who manages the Strait of Hormuz, or just a longer list of incidents exactly like this one, is the only question that's ever really mattered here. Everything else, the statements, the hotlines, the retaliatory strikes, is just noise generated by 2 sides arguing over a sentence they should have finished the first time. Let me know what you think in the comments, particularly if you think I've got the economic logic of the fee system wrong, because I think that's the part of this analysis most worth challenging. I'll see you in the next one.